My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. Today, we are going to talk a little bit about the EB-5 direct green card option. And when we talk about that option, we're going to talk about some recent changes to the program. We're going to talk about the EB-5 requirements, and we're also going to talk about some common tips that would assist you with putting together an EB-5 application. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping items. Scott Legal is a full service immigration law firm, but we do focus on investor visas like the EB-5 direct visa. We have a webinar series where we have webinars, at least 2 webinars every month. One of the things we're going to send you after this webinar is a list of all of the upcoming webinars, so you can sign up for new webinars in the future. The other things that we will send you after this webinar is done is we will send you a copy of this PowerPoint presentation that you see on the screen. The webinar is being recorded, so we will also send you a copy of the recording. And finally, we will send you an EB-5 guide. And the EB-5 guide really is a guide that goes over the comprehensive EB-5 requirements, some of the things that we're going to talk about during the presentation today. Finally, we're going to send you a link to our YouTube channel. And we do encourage you to sign up for to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the notification button, because we do regularly post the webinars that we do and also other immigration videos, and we post those on a regular basis, at least 3 or 4 a week. So without further ado, I will move through the presentation. So before we, jump into the EB-5 requirements, I do want to spend a couple of minutes going through the different types of investor visas that are available. So you'll see the investor visas listed, listed here. And the first one really is a visa, which is what's called a non-immigrant visa, and it's called an E2 visa. Now, the E2 visa is a visa where it requires an investment, but not nearly as much as the EB-5 that we're going to talk about. The investment for the E2 visa is a subjective amount. And also the E2 visa doesn't have a required number of jobs that have to be created. Another type of investor visa that's quite popular, especially since 2017, is a green card, and this is under the national interest waiver category. So there are 3 requirements that are listed here that have to be met to qualify under the national interest waiver category. And just the other thing I want to point out is that all of these visa categories, the E2, the national interest waiver, and the international entrepreneur rule that I'm going to speak briefly about in a minute, we do have separate webinars on all of these topics. So there are webinars that are 45 minutes to an hour long that you can either sign up for a future webinar, or you could go to our YouTube channel, and the webinars on these topics in the past have been recorded and are there. So the next immigration investor visa is called the international entrepreneur rule. And one of the big problems with the E2 visa is that the E2 visa is only available for nationals of certain countries. And there are about 80 of them, whereas the international entrepreneur rule doesn't have that particular requirement associated with it. And it's one where the individual themselves as well don't have to invest any money. So they could have an angel fund investor or venture capital investor that has invested $250,000 and meet some other relatively minor requirements to be able to qualify under that category. And then we come to the EB-5 green card. Now, just, I think it makes sense to go over a few recent changes. So when we think of EB-5, it's really broken down into 2 categories. So one category is the EB-5 direct category, which is what we are going to talk about, which is someone who wants to start their own business or someone who wants to invest in an existing business. And then the other EB-5 category is EB-5 regional center. In the EB-5 regional center, that's a much more passive form of investment. So that's where an individual would invest the amount in. Let's say that someone was, for example, building a hotel. They would invest the amount in that hotel chain, and in terms of creation of jobs, the hotel chain would be the one that would be responsible for creating the jobs. So a much more passive form of investment than the EB-5 direct, and really the individual is just giving someone else their money and hoping that that person or company creates the requisite number of jobs. And so in that sense, it is much more passive. Now, what happened in June of 2021 is that the regional center program was paused, and that's because the regional center program, it's not entrenched in fixed law. It's based on a program that has to be reauthorized every once in a while, and normally it gets reauthorized without issue, but unfortunately in June of 2021 it was paused, and it was really unprecedented because it really stopped people from being able to apply, and if there were pending applications, those applications couldn't be adjudicated. Now, we expect this program, or hope that this program will be restarted again in March of 2022. So in in a few days, in 10 days or so, but it remains to be seen. But now the other thing that happened was that when the program, just before the program was paused, the investment amount that was required for EB-5 was set at $900,000 if you were in a particular area, and we'll talk about that more, and 1.8 million if you weren't in that particular area. But then what happened is there was a lawsuit, and the people who sued won, and the lawsuit alleged that the government, at that time it was the last administration, that administration did not have the power to make those changes that they made, and the court agreed with them. So then the investment amounts went back to 500,000 and 1 million, depending on where the company was, and that's the current number. So as of the date of recording this, it's March 1st. The current investment that would be required for an EB-5 direct investment is 500,000, but we do expect that when the program gets reauthorized, hopefully March 11th, that amount will go up. So very limited time to be able to take advantage of the 500,000, but we are anticipating that the amount's only going to go up to 700,000 rather than 900,000. So now let's jump into the actual requirements of EB-5, and the requirements are they're listed out here. So let's just jump right into them. So we talked a little bit about the differences between the $500,000 investment and the $1 million investment. Now, what that means is that you're required to invest $500,000 if your business is in what's called a targeted employment area. And a targeted employment area is defined as an area where the unemployment rate is 1.5 times the national average. So that's what a targeted employment area is. You can also meet the $500,000 threshold if you are investing in what's called a rural area. So that will be an area that has a population below a certain amount, and that's going to be defined by the local jurisdiction. So if you don't meet those requirements, then you're required to invest $1 million. So now, and what we believe the amounts are going to go up to on March 11th is 700,000 and 850 or $900,000 at the higher end. But again, though, it won't be until that date where that's actually final. The individual would have to invest in what's called a new commercial enterprise. That's not a new business. It's a new commercial enterprise, defined as even an entity that was started in the 90s, but there is a cutoff date, and you would be investing that in that particular business. So you could either invest in the business, or you could start your own business and invest that amount to get the business up and running. In terms of what can be included, most of the expenses related to get a business up and running can be excluded, but there are some that can't. Unlike an E2, you're not allowed to include what are called administrative costs, so amounts that you pay to your lawyer or your accountant and things like that. You're not allowed to include those. So the expenditures would be on things more like staff, equipment, furniture, rent, things like that. The other thing is that when you invest, you can't just take, say $500,000 and put $500,000 in a business bank account. The money either has to be spent or committed. So committed means that, for example, you may have lease agreements where you're, committing that you're going to use the money, or you may have, staff that have started where the commitment is that you have to pay the salaries, etc. But it wouldn't be sufficient just to put $500,000 in a bank account and then apply for an EB-5 under the direct program. You would have to spend some and commit the majority of the remainder. So the other kind of key thing with respect to this, the investment can be made over time. We have one EB-5 direct case. A lot of EB-5 direct cases start out as E2s, and then they may be running as an E2 for some time. and then they decide that they want to apply for EB-5. So one of our EB-5 cases is a situation where the investment was made over 20 years ago, and it was made at different times, and that's completely fine. You just have to categorize the amounts and trace them and document them, but the investment can be made over time. It doesn't have to be like, one lump sum 500,000, and I'm using 500,000 as the example, if assuming that the entity is in a TEA, but it can be made over time. Another really important thing to recognize is that investment is not retained earnings. So let's say that you started an E2 business, and then the E2 business made, let's say $2 million in 1 year. And then you said, oh, wow, I have all this money sitting around in my business, and I want to spend that $2 million on all sorts of different things, and now apply for an EB-5. That doesn't work. The money has to be your personal investment and has to come from outside of the business. The only way that that could work in that situation is if the business had distributed the funds, you paid taxes on them, and then physically reinvested that money back into the company. So definitely it's not, even if the company made $10 million in that example and spent all of it, none of that amount would be considered investment. Investment is coming from your personal funds. If we talked a little bit about some of the differences between E2 and EB-5, but E2, there's no set investment amount. E2, there's no set number of employees that have to be hired. E2 doesn't mind if you purchase a business, and we're going to talk about that as it comes to EB-5. E2 as well allows you to include things in your investment like administrative costs, like legal fees, etc. One very big difference is that when someone is buying a business, so let's say someone is buying a restaurant, for example, and let's say the restaurant is $500,000. Now, if under E2, all that would have to happen is that the E2 investor would have to pay the person who's selling the restaurant the $500,000, and if the restaurant has employees, et cetera, then it's probably going to qualify for an E2. But that exact same case, if we were looking at EB-5, wouldn't qualify because the money was paid to the seller, and EB-5 doesn't permit that to happen. And so none of that money would be included as investment because it went to the seller, because EB-5 is focused on the money being invested in the actual business. And similarly, if that EB-5 company had employees already, when you're looking at 10 full-time employees, and we're going to talk about in the next section, none of those employees would count because they're employees that already existed in the business. Another, kind of interesting thing with respect to EB-5, and another, really this also falls under the differences between E2 and EB-5, is the whole idea of source of funds. So the analysis when we're doing E2 visas, in particular, if we're doing them at a consulate, is, we skim over source of funds very quickly and don't really spend a lot of time on that. However, if you are doing a EB-5 direct investment, the source of funds could be an extremely significant part of your petition. And typically it could be hundreds of pages because they really do source to the nth degree where the money came from. The legal standard's a simple one, that the money has to come from a legitimate source, but they really do take it to the nth degree in terms of documenting where the money came from. And this can be particularly problematic if, in the example I mentioned to you, where if the money is being invested over a significant period of time, then it can be particularly problematic because we may be asking for documents from a long time ago. And USCIS, they don't really care how long ago it was. They want the documents. They want the documents to show that the source of funds, that the money came from an actual legitimate source. Now, the investment has to be, for EB-5, it has to be an equity investment, so it can't be structured as a loan where you're kind of guaranteed to get principal back. That wouldn't work. So it can, and there's no, unlike E2, if you're in the investor, you're going to have to own 50% of the company. That's not required for EB-5. For EB-5, you could own a very, very small percentage of the company, even 1% or even less, and not have any control at all. But for E2, that wouldn't work. The other big thing with EB-5 is that a difference again between E2 and EB-5 is a job. So E2 doesn't have a specific number of jobs that have to be created, but EB-5 does, and it's 10 full-time jobs, and that is full-time, so not part-time. And also, because with E2, it doesn't really matter if they're if some of the jobs are part-time, that's not an issue. But also the jobs have to be US citizens or green card holders. So that's another difference between E2, is that only jobs where the people are US citizens or green card holders are going to count for the purposes of this. And for job creation, the service is willing to accept a business plan. It has to be a detailed business plan and comprehensive business plan, but that is, really what we include to show that the business is going to be able to create the full-time workers. And the full-time workers don't have to be created right away. They can be created a couple of years after the first petition has been approved. And it is important to kind of document the full-time workers and their ability to work in the U.S. Given the fact that they can only be green card holders and U.S. citizens. In terms of filing of an EB-5 petition, it's in a few different parts. So the I-526 part is the first part that really shows that you've met all of the above requirements, all the requirements that I just went through. And that unfortunately is taking 2 to 3 years for just that to be approved. And then once that's approved, and unfortunately you can't file this concurrently, but once that's approved, if you're in the United States, you can file an I-485, and if you're outside of the United States, you can consular process. And then after you've had the green card for 2 years, you have to go back to the US government and file another petition, which is an I-829 petition, showing that you actually have created those US jobs. And once you have provided them with that information, then they would remove the conditions on your green card and issue perhaps issue a 10-year green card rather than a 2-year green card. So one of the questions that came in as we were going through the requirements is whether or not the EB-5 amount could be based on a bank loan, and it absolutely could. But the only issue with the bank loan is that it would have to be either unsecured, or the security would have to be your personal assets. If it was actually, secured, then against the company assets, then that would be a problem. That's the only time a loan is an issue. The some other kind of considerations in some of these we talked about a little bit as well. The at-risk investment. So that's why I use the example of, you can't just invest $500,000 and put it in a business bank account and say I'm done and apply. The money has to actually be at risk, and at risk means that it's either spent or it's committed. So they want to distinguish between people who have invested and people who just have the intent to invest. Loans and gifts are fine, as we just talked about. Loans and gifts are fine as well. If you do gifts, because of the long dated nature of these petitions, you have to be sure that the person who gave you the gift pays the gift tax in their jurisdiction, because after 2 years pass, the government will come back and make sure that and confirm that they've actually done that. And again, with loans, they either have to be unsecured or secured against your personal assets, but not the business assets couldn't be. So if you bought if you invested in a business, and let's say that in order to buy a particular asset, there was a mortgage on that particular asset, that would be a problem, because the security is actually going to be part of the business. And we talked about the considerations of purchasing a business. Generally speaking, the example I used was, if you're buying a restaurant, for example, it's not that can't qualify for EB-5, but what the $500,000 that you paid for the restaurant wouldn't qualify as investment. So you would have to invest another $500,000 and create 10 new jobs for that to be able to qualify. In terms of the investment structure, as we mentioned, you can own a very small percentage, unlike E2. And there can be no guarantees of returns. This has to be an investment. There can be no guarantees of returns. So that's, we do scour the documentation to make sure that there is nothing in there, that there is nothing in there that would be a problem. And we talked a lot about these things that you would consider for moving from E2 to an EB-5. Like some of the things are have to do with what amounts can be included, because we have to go through and we have to categorize. Okay, well, this was included for E2, but we can't include it for EB-5, etc. We do have to look at the jobs that were created, because if someone invested $100,000 on their E2, and they started hiring US workers, some of those are going to count, right? That's not a problem. Some of those can count, but we do have to look at the documentation to make sure that they're US citizens, green card holders, and full-time, because those are the only ones that can count. We talked about not buying a business already. So we're going to go through an example to illustrate a few of the points that we talked about during the presentation. So we're going to say that Helen, she had an E2 visa that she started in 2015, and she purchased a business for $300,000, right? So let's say, the restaurant example I use. The business had 5 full-time employees when she purchased the shares of the business, right? So at the end of the 2019, so 4 years have passed, she took another 200,000 that was given to her as a gift. So someone gave her that money. And the person who gave her the gift obtained the money from the sale of property they inherited 15 years ago. So, let's say an aunt inherited property 15 years ago and gave her that money. Instead of giving the money to Helen, the aunt actually deposited the money directly into Helen's business bank account. Right, and this is something that I didn't touch on as much, but the example will illustrate what the issue is here. When the money was invested, so the 200,000, the new 200,000 that she put in 2019, she had 10 full-time employees working at the company. So remember, she started with 5, now she has 10. At the end of 2019, she paid herself a bonus of $100,000 after the company made $1 million. And then on January 1st, 2020, she applied for the EB-5 program, showing a total investment of 1.5, which was the 300,000 that she initially invested, the 200,000 that she got as a gift, and then the $1 million that the company made. Right, so you add on her application that she made, she's invested in. She also said that she created the 10 full-time jobs already. Right, so what are the issues here? So first and foremost, the first issue is that the money that she spent for the E2 can't be counted towards the EB-5, because that's money she gave to the seller. So 300,000, you can take that, right off the top. The second thing to take a look at is the 200,000. That's money that she got as a gift. So that money that she invested in her company, that certainly can count. However, the person who gave her the money, we need extensive source of funds. So if that person inherited the money, the government doesn't care that the person who gave who left the money for the aunt is no longer alive. They still want documentation showing where that person got the money, even though the sale of the property related to something from 15 years ago. So extensive documentation that would be needed for that source of funds. So now we're up to 200,000 if we can prove that. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is the business had 5 employees when she purchased it. So those 5 employees don't count towards the 10. She'll have time after she invests the 500,000 to create and gets the I-526 approved to create those jobs, but those 5 initial don't get included at all. Now, the other big issue in this case is that instead of giving the money to Helen, the aunt deposited the money directly into the business bank account. It is important for Helen to actually have physical control and possession of the funds before they go into the business. So in that case, we definitely would have recommended the aunt give the money to Helen, and then Helen put the money into the business bank account. So the other 5 employees that were hired, it looks like they're full-time, so that's great. They're going to count towards the 10. Now, the other big issue here, so let's say we change the example slightly and said that, the 300,000 did count, and now let's say she's at the $500,000 mark. When an owner pays themselves a bonus, right? Because let's say, let's say we change the example. In 2019, she invested $500,000, right? So now in 2019, she invested $500,000 and she took a bonus of $100,000. The government in that instance is going to say, well, that's nice. She only invested $400,000 because $100,000 actually went to her. So when you're right at the amount of the 500,000, you really have to be careful when you look at distributions to owners, because that can really come back to haunt you, and USCIS will raise it. And so we see from what she wrote, like the 300,000 didn't count, the 200,000 may count, and then the $1 million doesn't count at all. That's the $1 million that related to the company, the company's earnings, that doesn't count at all. So it's an example that, that illustrates, and she plans to hire another 3 or 4 employees going forward, but is not committed to this. Well, in order to get this particular visa, she's going to have to do that, hire more employees, that is. So the next thing, just some other considerations. EB-5 petitions take a long time to be approved, right? So 2 years for at least for the I-526 petition, and then another 1.5 years for the green card, and that's if things go really well, right? So the other thing to keep in mind is there are country-specific quotas. We don't really see this coming into effect much. It has come into effect with China, I think with India, with I think Vietnam at one point, but I think that right now the categories are pretty current. So, but part of that has to do with the fact that the regional center program is paused. So you do have to kind of like, if you're on some other type of visa like E2 or another type of visa, you do have to really look at the expiration dates and really plan appropriately, especially if your visas aren't dual intent visas. Like if, for example, an E2 visa is not a dual intent visa. One other thing to definitely consider is, looking at parallel green card strategies. We just had a direct investment EB-5 approved recently for one of our clients who was an E2 client. And she we were also filing a national interest waiver petition for her. And the national interest waiver petition seemed like a very strong petition. And we may still continue with that because getting the green card under national interest waiver might be better than the EB-5 because she doesn't have to worry about the job creation and kind of removing the conditions after a couple of years. So that's that's something that can be good to look at multiple strategies. And we do have another question that came in. It says, may two investors qualify for the immigration based on pooled investment in a single business? Absolutely. Two investors, 3, 4, 5, it doesn't matter. Just for each investment, each investor who wants the green card, the business has to create 10 full-time jobs. So let's say it was in a targeted employment area. If there were 3 investors, each of them invested 500,000, and then so 1.5 million was invested, then that particular entity would have to create 30 jobs in order to qualify for EB-5. Another question here: how can I know if my area is a targeted employment area? So the easiest way to so it's a great question, and one of the reasons it's a great question is because it's one of the big changes in the new legislation. So in the past, when the amount was 500,000, so those are the current rules now because all of the changes were eliminated. So in the past, what was happened is the way that the rules worked before, it was very easy to game the system. So even that example that I just told you about, where the applicant was approved for an EB-5, her office was in Soho, and that was considered a TEA. And it was because the old rules allowed you to join census tracts together to come up with the 1.5% national average if you could. The unemployment rate 1.5 times the national average. So what we did is we joined census tracts all the way through Washington Heights, Bronx, etc., and we were able to show that her her business, even though it was in Soho, one of the richest areas in the country, it was in what was considered a TEA for the purpose of the statute. But that's one thing that they changed when they increased the investment amount to 900,000. That's one thing that they changed and said that now the federal government has exclusive jurisdiction with determining that. But generally speaking, if the question is how do you find out, you find it's statistics, right? So if you let's say you do have a census tract and your business is in that particular census tract, they publish the unemployment rates for those census tracts. And if you are 1.5 times the national average just based on what was published, then you're golden, right? But then if you're not, then you may have to look at another way of being able to, perhaps still meet the standard. The next question is, do we need all investment made up front or at the same time of application? We made 20% of 900,000 and the rest over 3 to 4 years. So it's a great question. My advice to you whenever you're filing an EB-5 petition is to invest the full amount up, like before you actually file the application. There is limited basis for like this kind of a concept of promissory note and kind of not doing that. However, it's always going to be subject to much more scrutiny and or denial. So you could get way down the road, 2-3 years down the road, and they finally get to your petition, and then you're denied on that point. So it is always there is a process for it, but always better to invest the full amount so that you are not opening yourself up to possible risk with that. Perfect. And I think that is all of the questions. Yep, I think that's all of the questions answered. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending the webinar. As I said previously, we will this has been recorded, and we will send out the recording, and we'll also send out the guide. We will also send out the a link where you can sign up for more webinars, and our YouTube channel, so you can sign up. And when we do send out the recording, it will actually be put onto the YouTube channel. So if you clicked on it to look at it, you would be able to you would be able to access it there. And again, if you have any additional questions, you can definitely set up a consultation with me, and you can do that directly on our website. Again, thank you very much for joining. Bye-bye.